This started out as a controlled burn. Soon it turned out of control. The Pine Bush Preserve Commission was trying to clear a small portion of its land, but high winds pushed it into an adjacent area and it spread. 150 firefighters from Albany, Guilderland, and Colony called in to fight it.
I couldn't tell. The winds were probably gusting 25, 30 miles an hour today, and it just pushed the fire every which way. And we finally got it contained on the north side, pushed everything to the east.
At one point, the fire jumped the thruway near Route 155. Buildings in Washington Square even turned on their lawn sprinklers to help the firefighters.
By the time the fire came down the hillside, they had gotten here, so really, I don't think the building was ever in danger.
All the while, smoke shut down much of the thruway between exits 24 and 25. Overhead, helicopters dumped water trying to douse the flames. The wind continued to be a major factor in the battle. By nightfall, the blaze was pretty much out. About 75 acres charred. With the windy, dry condition, the big question is why have a controlled burn on a day like today? Well, the Pine Bush Preserve says they were well within their protocol when they made that decision. It says humidity, moisture levels, and even the wind were within their proper range when the burn began.
Our forecast was within prescription, and the winds were forecasted to hold within that prescription. And the winds picked up later today, and that was probably one of the issues that we were dealing with.
The Pine Bush Commission says it will regroup and assess its protocol after today's fire. There were no injuries or property damage in the blaze, and the Pine Bush says vegetation should start growing back within the next 2 weeks.
And burns aren't that unusual at all in the Pine Bush. They do it a lot.
You see controlled burns almost every year.
because this is a human factors thing and we're asking you to be in the shoes of the decision makers, don't be afraid. In fact, I encourage you to ask people about their emotional state and the emotional state of people around them at the time that they're talking. That's very important. So don't be afraid and feel free to ask people. You know, how are you feeling? You know, how did your emotions play into this? How are people around you acting? That's fair game. You know, remember, it's all about the learning. That's why we're going out there, is to learn from other people's experience. What's different about this staff ride from many other staff rides is a lot of the learning is going to come from positive example. You know, quite often we're going out and doing a staff ride on something where somebody got burned over, killed, whatever, and most of the learning comes from negative example. A lot of the learning in this staff ride will come from positive example. But I also want to make sure that you understand, it wasn't perfect. I mean, obviously, you didn't set out to have a 75-acre burn. You didn't set out to close down the New York State Thruway at rush hour. You know, there are definitely things that went awry here, and we want to learn from both the positive and the negative.
And then on every one of our burns, of course, we have the objectives of learning about smoke behavior, particularly in the urban interface here. Smoke is a huge issue for us. And then fire behavior in these fuels. We want to learn as much as we can, and looking back, we learned a lot. And so we basically want to know what pitch pine scrub oak barrens will do in different weather conditions and fuel conditions. As far as unit preparation, I'm just going to go over real quickly a little bit of how we set up a unit prior to a burn. Basically, the north line we mowed a fire break, and the south line we mowed a fire break. This line here pretty much stayed. What you see today is pretty much what it looked like. Maybe a little more trimming along the edges of some of the fuels, but generally a nice sandy trail works pretty well. But the north and south lines we mowed much wider than required in prescription. Prescription requires 6 to 12 foot wide. We mowed them about 35 to 40 foot wide with a hydro axe. We did that because we knew that adjacent fuels were very volatile and also very receptive, and that going after anything in them would be difficult. And so we gave ourselves a much wider break along the edges of our unit. The organization on this particular burn, like I said, I was the fire leader as a trainee. Chris Hauver was a line boss on the north line and also the burn boss for this burn. Keep that one in mind. And then the south line, Neil Gifford, our conservation director, was the line boss there. And then the rest of our crew, we have 13 on crew, would be assigned to one of the two line bosses. And we burned this unit as a typical sort of ring fire scenario where each crew is both holding and ignition. So we didn't have a separate ignition team or crew. We would basically light the edges of the unit, and if we needed interior, each line boss would coordinate that with me, and we'd do any interior that we needed to do if necessary along the lines. Okay. We also have a smoke spotter who was out along the thruway. And then we also have someone who's obviously taking weather for us every half hour during the burn, who's on one of the lines, but is generally put in a low-level role because they're going to be pulled out a lot to be taking weather for us. As far as our contingency plan, which of course is always a part of our briefing, our plan prior to this event was pretty bare bones as far as contingency. We talked about fallback lines. We would talk about what we would do in the event that something slopped over, but not in a lot of detail. And if we had anything that we felt we couldn't contain ourselves, we would call 911. And the way it works here for us is once that 911 resource, in this case like the City of Albany Fire Department, gets here, we would turn command, well, I and Chris would turn command over to them. And they would actually manage the event, and we would become a resource to them. We don't have the ability in-house to manage the big picture situation, and so we actually would turn it over to them and then become available to help out wherever they put us as a crew. We were in prescription with wind speeds, we were in prescription with our fuel moistures, we were in prescription, even though they were low. And RH was also on the low end. We were in the 31, 32 range, bottom of prescription is 30. Okay. Squirrely winds are not abnormal for us. In fact, I've never burned here in the pine bush without having squirrely winds. Because of our dune formations, the winds are going all over the place. And then we put fire breaks in, and these trails tend to catch the wind also and push them all kinds of funny directions. So that wasn't abnormal to me. It wasn't abnormal to Chris or to Neil. None of us felt really uncomfortable with that. We had a dominant wind direction going, and that's what we're always looking for on the day of a burn. But little shifts here and there, that was typical. So at 11:52 a.m., which was a little early for us, a lot of times we wouldn't even start till afternoon because we're waiting for the wind to settle in at some direction. We lit a test fire right here behind where you're standing, and it was similar in that it was a lot of blueberry and huckleberry, minus the leaves, because remember we're in April, but still very volatile, very flashy. And we basically tested in the shade, we tested in the fuels that were here, and then we tested out onto this slightly south slope here with our test fire. And the test fire was about 15 minutes. We watched, saw what was happening. It was definitely lively, it was definitely burning well, but we were kind of used to that, I guess in a sense. I wouldn't say I was necessarily comfortable with it from the standpoint of I've never been comfortable with a burn here in the pine bush, but it was something that we'd seen a lot. And so it didn't put up any red flags for any of us at that point in time.
In the weather forecast, they hadn't predicted any of these winds, even like later on into the evening or the next day?
Not to the best of my knowledge. Basically what we didn't all have cell phones back then, but we did have a bag phone in our one truck. Remember those things? And so we would call DEC meteorology just before the test burn and basically get as close to a spot weather forecast as we could get. And they didn't give us any indication at that point in time that there was anything kind of different happening. The other thing I will say though is that I don't remember a pine bush burn that didn't have winds coming from other directions during the burn. It's just standard.
So your weather observer, was that person moving or taking weather at a consistent location?
Good question. If you notice on the little sheet, they at the beginning they took one on the ridge, and then they came down into the valley and stayed down here the rest of the burn.
So was that picking up? Was that person picking up the winds?
Possibly not. Very good point.
At that point, what was the familiarity and I guess experience level of the burn crew that you had out here? Were they familiar with the area, and what was their experience level? And yours as well?
We had some seasonal staff on our fire crew. Some of them had quite a bit of experience. Some of them, I'm trying to remember, I think there was one of them who was quite green, not a lot of experience. We had Neil, Chris, and myself, who, I guess, mediocre experience at the higher side. We had a DC forest ranger. So I guess what I would say is it was kind of a mixed bag.
The subject of weak signals pretty hard in the last day and a half. And I don't mean you specifically, but you, the team.
Yeah.
Do you, looking back, were there weak signals up to this point in the burn that you could have picked up on that you didn't pick up on, or you didn't pay attention to?
I think honestly at this point, there wasn't much that was really making me think this is quite different from a lot of other burns. I've been on a lot of burns here. I've had burns turn 180 degrees and go downhill. The first burn I was on did that. Took out 10 acres in about 2 minutes, sounded like a freight train. I knew that wasn't normal or good based on the noise on the radio. But on the other hand, I've seen a lot of that sort of thing. That's what these fuels do. That's what happens. So no, I don't think there was a lot that was really keying me into something different for this particular day.
Do you think that anybody else was uncomfortable with anything about the burn?
Well, after the fact, I know that there were a couple of folks who were. But as of my actually picking up on something, I would say no, I wasn't aware of that.